I'm American, born and raised. I'm a Westerner. I'm an Irish German American. I speak English because that's my language. I dress the way I do. I talk the way I do. And I know what I know because I'm from the West. I'm not talking as an outsider. I come from there. You act like being from there, being a Westerner is supposed to somehow disqualify me from criticizing the West, but it's actually exactly what qualifies me. I know what I'm talking about. I was raised in Pharaoh's palace, in the palace of Pharaoh. I know what goes on there. I know the mentality of the people. I know the mentality of the people in that palace, how they think. I know the ideas and the attitudes that fester in the insulation and isolation behind those walls. Pharaoh's palace was an echo chamber, and so was America.
Hello guys, welcome once again to the channel. I hope wherever you're watching, you're having a great time. Now, most of the times when you watch global news, you'll get to understand that there are certain segments of talking points that have always been used to really push the global discourse. One of them is talking about money, another one is talking about the markets, and another one is talking about the military strength of different nations. So the Western conceptualization of global happenings and news is categorized in these three strands. We have money, how people are doing, how economy is doing, how markets are behaving, and then we also have the other aspect, talking about how military are doing. And that is why you'll realize that there are certain wars that are being reported about in different countries. There are certain countries that are having tensions between themselves. So this is what has always been packaged as news to be fed to the global population. But is this really what happens? So today we dive into a powerful commentary by Shahid Bolsen, who challenges the pervasive grip of intellectual colonization on the global South and Muslim world. In his thought-provoking analysis, Bolsen exposes how dominant global powers impose their language, values, and frameworks to control narratives and stifle authentic self-expression. He calls for a bold act of refusal, rejecting the predator's tongue to reclaim cultural and intellectual sovereignty. I want us to watch this clip of him talking about this entire issue. Then we shall talk in the end.
Well, it's an old concept that you're supposed to speak the language that people understand, right? If you want to communicate with people, you have to speak the language that they understand. That usually is referenced in the context of the oppressed versus the oppressor. And that's interpreted to mean, if not said explicitly, that the only language that the oppressor understands is violence. Or else the only language they understand is money, profit, what have you. So usually when people invoke this truism, that's what they're talking about. Like saying, you can't go to a violent people in the language of peace. You can't go to a profit-driven people in the language of morality. And okay, that's logical. That's all logical and true, and I believe that. Generally speaking, there's nothing wrong with that idea. But my point is, I don't want to communicate with you. You understand? I don't want to learn your language. Why should I? I don't want to start learning your ways. I don't want to start learning your language. I don't want to start learning your approach. And if the only reason that I am learning all of that is so that I can talk to you, what's the point? I don't have to deal with you at all. If you're not learning my language to talk to me, I'm not going to learn your language to talk to you. Why should I? What's the benefit of communicating with you anyway? We just don't have to talk. You have an ugly language. You have a primitive language. And yes, I'm not just talking about language in the linguistic sense, obviously. I'm talking in terms of that truism. If the only language that you know is the language of violence, then we have nothing to talk about. If the only language that you know is the language of money, then we have nothing to talk about. If you don't speak the language of peace, if you don't speak the language of morality, if you don't speak the language of justice, well, then we're never going to be able to communicate anyway. And if I learn your language, if I learn your language of blood and greed and injustice, then I have let you degrade me. No. Why should I accommodate you to talk to you in your language when, in fact, there's nothing meaningful, there's nothing beneficial that I can get from that kind of conversation? That's refusal. And refusal is a universal language. You don't need to speak Chinese or Vietnamese or Arabic or French in order to understand what it means when someone gives you the cold shoulder. Everyone understands that. When someone ghosts you, That's a language all on its own. When someone ignores you, that's understood no matter what language you speak. You're not part of our conversations if you do not speak our language. And when we're speaking in the language of sovereignty, when we're speaking in the language of stability and peace and dignity, and you come with the language of subordination, the language of destabilization and degradation and violence, we have nothing to say to each other. And if you don't learn our language, then we never will have anything to say to each other. And I'm not going to learn your language. I'm not a native speaker of that tongue. You understand me? And yes, if I start learning your language, I start learning your lexicon, then I'm going to start learning your idioms, your axioms, your frames of reference. And pretty soon your ways will start contaminating my ways. I might lose grasp of my native tongue. And this is all a major part of colonizing the psyche. You know, remember, I'm using language as an analogy here, even though it does work also literally. You know, when you learn the colonizer's language, you start using the colonizer's language, literally their language, like English or French or what have you. Then you get comfortable in their language and you start to lose track of your native language, you know, literally, linguistically. But metaphorically, it's the same. You learn their language and you lose your own language. You start using their frames of reference, you start using their theories, their philosophies, their interpretations, their worldview, their paradigms, you know, their understanding. And then you forget your own. You forget your own paradigms, your own understanding. And now they've got you. And look, before anyone says, but they force themselves on us, so we have to deal with them effectively. That's why we have to learn their language. Yes, of course, I understand. But we're Muslims. We know how to deal with people who force themselves on us. We have that in our language. We don't have to learn their language in order to know how we're supposed to manage in that kind of a situation. We follow our own rules. And no, that doesn't just mean, violence or armed resistance. We have a very high language in Islam, a very complex moral and intellectual language in Islam that gives us a vast vocabulary for dealing with any issue. We have a whole repertoire of strategies for dealing with aggression, for dealing with conflict. That's revealed in the Quran, that's revealed in the Sunnah, the stories of the prophets, you know, and 1400 years of history and jurisprudence. No, our language is vast. Our language is vast and sophisticated, intellectually, morally, culturally, politically. You have a primitive binary language. We don't. The important thing here is to recognize that they do operate in a completely different framework from us. Recognize that they do speak a different language. And understand from that this means that we are not going to communicate, period. That's a fact. And I think that's been our error, the error of many, many people across the global south. It isn't that we failed to learn the colonizer's language. It's that we mistakenly thought that they spoke our language. Understand what I'm saying? Meaning we mistakenly thought that their moral language, their ethical language, their intellectual language, we thought that was the same as ours, and it isn't. It isn't at all. And yes, you have to understand that, like I said, their language is a primitive language. I know that. I know it because I grew up speaking that language. And again, no, I'm not talking about English. You know, we're talking about the moral language, the cultural language, the philosophical language, the paradigmatic civilizational language here. And it's a primitive language in the West. It's a simplistic language in the West. I can't emphasize enough how important this is for you to understand if you come from the global south or the Muslim world. They are handicapped in terms of their internal civilizational development because of the simplicity of their language. See, again, think about the phrase, talk to them in their language, or talk to them in the language that they understand, right? That's how it goes. Okay, first thing that means is that they do not speak your language. We focus too much on how this means that we are not speaking their language. But we need to focus on the fact that they do not speak our language. You know, if your language is Tawheed, the oneness of Allah, the oneness of God, and our servitude and our accountability to Allah, while their language is power is God, and power means the ability to force others to do whatever you want, well, we can't communicate in those languages. Those are two completely different languages. There's not even a way to translate the difference in these languages. You know, let me be clear here also that the West does not speak the civilizational language that they print on their brochures. rights, freedom, liberty, reason, and so forth. These are marketing slogans. So don't think that that's their civilizational language. No, that's packaging. And you won't understand that unless you are looking at them from the vantage point of your own pure epistemology. You have to look at them from where you are and see what you see and call what you're seeing according to your own definitions. Because if you let them tell you what they're doing, then you're never going to be able to make it add up. Because what they're doing and what they say they're doing are two completely different things. If you listen to them, it's going to be like wearing noise canceling headphones while listening to like an audio book of Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life while your family is screaming and getting slaughtered downstairs. And you won't be able to hear them because you hear Jordan Peterson telling you about how great the West is. I'm telling you, you need to pay attention to what's really going on with Western so-called civilization. Not what they tell you, not what they say, not what they say to gaslight you about what they're doing. You already know this in your gut. I mean, you've seen them burn villages to save villages in Vietnam. You've seen them sanction children to defend human rights. You've seen them bankrupt whole countries, whole populations to protect free trade. See, they always attach noble slogans to their savagery. And if you accept their epistemology, then you're going to be basically accepting to inflict upon yourself cognitive dissonance. No, you have to look at them from your own vantage point, and you have to define their actions by your own terms and determine for yourself what they truly believe by your own objective observations from that vantage point. Their civilizational language is might makes right. And then they repaint or they redefine what right is by telling you that right is whatever might just did. That redefining and that repainting is what the so-called Western civilization calls its values. Please understand me. That's what they think values are, just packaging. That's what they think values are. So look at the contrast these two civilizational languages. The Tawhidic grammar of Islam, which whether or not Muslims live up to it, the grammar of Islam binds power to justice under divine audit. But you can contrast that with the predator grammar of the modern West, which binds morality to power only for presentation purposes. It's like putting a heart emoji on the side of a missile. Okay? When Western officials speak, you're usually hearing one of three layers. Layer one is the myth, the sacred words that are recited for legitimacy, universal rights, rule of law, democracy, rational progress, reason, liberty, so on and so on and so on. Then level two is the interface, which is the language that's used to satisfy the elite and to write policy papers, to secure markets for capital. That's going to be about governance, reform, transparency, inclusion, development, and so on. And then you get down to layer three, that's the real operative language, the real program code, the moral language that actually allocates pain and profit, victimization and exploitation, extract, enclose, securitize, neutralize resistance, institutionalize impunity, might makes right. Okay, the first two layers are just soundproofing around the third layer, you understand? The first two layers are only there to obscure the third layer, which is their real language. They cushion their viciousness with virtue. That's what those other two layers are about. Islam doesn't work that way. And I'm not being idealistic about this. Now, I'm not saying that Muslims are perfect. Sin and hypocrisy exists among Muslims just like it does anyone else, sure. But the grammar does not authorize that. The Quran gives no quarter to sin and to hypocrisy, and it defines what it is. And the Sunnah of Rasulullah ﷺ hones that definition further. The law codifies it, and the hereafter punishes it. In Islam, the program language is the moral code. That's the only layer we have. Obedience, justice, mercy, accountability, protection of life, intellect, lineage, property, and faith. We fail often, but failure is breach, not design. In the Western order, breach is not failure. Breach is design. See, the Muslims, we did not build a moral and ethical language, a civilizational language. We didn't build that around us. We built ourselves around the moral and ethical and civilizational language that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed and that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam embodied. Do you understand? We did not create the code The code created us. That's why we're Muslims in the first place. And that's why we're Muslims first. Not Arab, not African, not Asian, not American, not European, not so-called black, and not so-called white. We are Muslims. Our nation is the Ummah, the middle nation. Okay, that's a moral citizenship. It's a belief-based nationalism, a belief-based identity. We don't get to sprinkle glitter on filth and call it diamonds. We have to be real. We have to be real, or we risk losing our citizenship. We risk having our passport revoked, that is our means by which we enter Jannah. We lose our whole sense of identity when we don't take Islam seriously. It's not packaging for us. But that predator moral grammar, that's different. The Western so-called civilization, their code is cruelty. That's their program code, not the user-friendly operating system that you see. Their first rule in language is to convert every relationship into an extractive interface. You know, land becomes an asset. Water becomes, a futures contract. All human attention becomes a source for ad revenue. Identity is nothing but something to use for branded advocacy merchandise. The second rule is to monetize any sort of asymmetry. If I control finance, law, and tech, it doesn't matter what you have, because you need me to let you even access what you have. They convert their own their dependency on the resources that others have into those people's dependency on them, until they thank you for extracting their wealth. And then they always wrap extraction in moral language, you know, human rights audits that are bundled with privatization, democracy promotion that's supplied via regime change, you know, humanitarian corridors that always track pipelines. And then you always try to offload risk. This is also their language. Environmental collapse, labor injury, currency crises, always push the liabilities down to the periphery, down the chain to the periphery, to the poor and to the unborn. And then it's part of their language to always make sure that they have an architecture for impunity. If you're in the core, then your crimes are accomplishments. But if you're in the periphery, even accusations will earn you sanctions and conviction. Adaptive hypocrisy is part of their language. Contradiction doesn't wound their reputation. It's a strategic asset for them. Today's principle is whatever validates yesterday's actions, yesterday's atrocity, yesterday's pillage. But Islam starts from the opposite pole. Power is a trust. Wealth is custodial. The creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, nature, is not a set of asset classes. It's a set of ayat, signs from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that will indict you if you exploit them unjustly. Every human being is both an abd and a khalifa, a slave and a steward. Your wealth carries embedded claims from the poor. Even your business contracts can be worshipped if they honor justice, and they will be sinful if they cheat. There's no lobbies on Yawm al-Qiyamah. This grammar ties every domain, governance, trade, family, environment, all back to a single axis. Did you keep trust with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and with His creation? Or did you transgress the boundaries and commit dhulm? Notice, in the Islamic language, the language of Islam, a human being's failure triggers repentance and repair, because the standard is external to power. But in the predator grammar, power rewrites the standard so that failure never even registers. They rewrite what is moral according to what they're capable of doing. When the West talks about rights, they mean marketable license, unevenly enforced. Rights are protected when they secure investor mobility, and suspended if they obstruct extraction in any way. Just ask any sanctioned country about their right to food and their right to medicine. When they talk about freedom, the only freedom that they are serious about is deregulation of capital. When they talk about democracy, it means the status quo of tyranny by the unelected rich. It's just packaging for regime change in every other part of the world. If our governments block foreign acquisition, then our people deserve democracy. If our government greenlights your extractive deal, then it means that our governments are stable. And when the West talks about reason, what they mean is the exclusion of morality from judgment. Rule of law, so-called, descends with full force upon the weak, on behalf of the strong. If you're weak, they prosecute. If you're rich, they negotiate. Settlements above, sentences below. Look, these aren't bad words in and of themselves. They're captured words. We don't reject the concepts. We reject any claim that you actually believe in those concepts or practice those concepts. You only use those concepts for camouflage. So for anyone in the global South, the next time any Western envoy comes to you talking about wanting to have a partnership or make a deal, there's 5 silent tests that you should run in your head. Is there symmetry in enforceability? In other words, can they be held to the same terms that they impose upon you? And if not, it's unfair and it's a myth. It's a setup. Then ask yourself, who absorbs the downside risk? The pollution, for example, the default inflation that might happen. If it's only on you, it's a setup. Then ask yourself, can you withdraw without financial asphyxiation, without sanctions, without covert destabilization? If not, it's a setup. Ask yourself, are you free to publicly criticize the deal without being throttled, without reputational assassination? If not, this is a setup. Ask yourself, would they accept to have the identical terms, the identical logic used on them? If not, this is a setup. See, the only reason to learn their language is so that you know what they're really saying, so that you can understand what they're saying. You can learn their language, but never use their language. You can't use their language without degrading yourself, because again, it's a primitive moral language. So you have to be ruthlessly bilingual. You understand? Be fluent in their interface, but rooted in your own epistemology, so that you can accurately identify what their real code is, what the code is that they're actually following underneath the pretty interface. You know, translate outward, but anchor inward. And if you're going to use their terms, their concepts, every time you use one of their, glamour words, you need to bind that to a non-fungible Islamic definition and a measured test. Don't say freedom unless you add freedom from debt slavery, freedom from data harvesting without consent, freedom from wage coercion, freedom from compulsory complicity in oppression. You understand? Don't say development unless you add childcare, fair labor, actual metrics of human well-being, community food security, Gaza supplied, not besieged. If they refuse the test, then you have exposed the packaging. Before you enter into any arrangement with the West, trade, security, media licensing, whatever, run a quick RPI-style audit. Who holds the decision authority in this relationship, in this agreement, in this partnership? Who controls the critical inputs? Who can retaliate without cost? How adaptable are we if we pull the plug on this agreement? What dependencies are we locking ourselves into? Map your positives, map your exposures, and if the spread is too wide, then no amount of strategic partnership language is going to save you. You're negotiating surrender terms, not partnership terms. This is a concern when we're talking about the GCC, for example, partnering with BlackRock and with a national OCGFC for establishing a new Middle East, for establishing the vision for the new Middle East. I've said all along that there are risks involved in this because these people are predators. The a national OCGFC are predators. And right now, particularly in, of course, Gaza and also in Syria, I think that we're seeing a battle going on between the military-industrial complex aligned nationalistic OCGFC, which supports Zionism. We're seeing a battle now between them and the allied faction of the a-national OCGFC and the GCC and BRICS, a battle for controlling outcomes in the region. And the danger is because the a-national OCGFC is not as invested as BRICS and the GCC in the vision for the region. They have contingency options for how to continue profiting from destruction. They all agree that stability is best, that that's the optimal outcome, but the military-industrial complex, the neocons, the nationalistic, Zionist, OCGFC, they're not going down without a fight. But in my opinion, in my estimation, BRICS and the GCC are in a stronger position in terms of the relative power index vis-a-vis the a-national OCGFC and vis-a-vis the nationalistic OCGFC. So don't learn their language in order to communicate with them in their language. Learn their language to expose that their real moral language employs deception and camouflage all the time. The West cannot function without narrative legitimacy. Its machine requires constant laundering, narrative laundering. So withdraw your consent for their narrative. Attach conditional access. The exchange has to be on our terms. You know, if you want access to our capital, well, we want accountability for you. Then you have to either negotiate on real terms or escalate nakedly, burning the whole narrative. And that's what's happening now. And remember, Islam does not need to imitate Western hypocrisy in order to win. No, our comparative advantage is that our declared grammar and our moral machine code are meant to be the same thing. When we fail, we repent. When they fail, they just rebrand. That's a structural vulnerability for them, so exploit that. Stop debating their brochure, their pretend language. Speak to the engine. Anchor in Tawheed. Audit power. Weaponize truth. Repossess captured words. Refuse relationships that hide slavery in the fine print. The middle nation, the Ummah, is not going to outspin empire, but we will out-truth empire. We will out-trust empire. We will outlast empire by aligning our speech with the reality that all power answers to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Predators rule by darkness, but a stewardship rules by the light. So flip the switch and watch the cockroaches scatter.
So from watching the entire clip, you'll realize that Shahid Bolsen delivers a compelling critique of the composition of Western-centric language and frameworks on global discourse, particularly in the context of Muslim and global South nations. He argues that the dominant global powers described metaphorically as predators enforce their linguistic and conceptual paradigms centered on money, markets, and military might as the sole legitimate mode of communication. This imposition, Bolsen asserts, is a form of intellectual colonization that stifles authentic self-expression and enforces marginalized communities to articulate their aspirations within a framework that inherently disadvantages them. By framing refusal as a universal language, he emphasizes the power of rejecting this imposed narrative outright, advocating for reclamation of indigenous epistemologies and modes of thought, local values, and priorities over Western hegemony. Bolsen elaborates that speaking the predator's tongue means adopting the values, metrics, and priorities of global powers which often revolve around economic dominance, militarization, and cultural assimilation. He critiques the expectation that nations and peoples must translate their struggles, histories, and aspirations into norms accepted by Western institutions, such as framing resistance as terrorism or economic independence as instability. This linguistic coercion, he argues, distorts the realities of the global South and Muslim world, compelling them to justify their existence within a paradigm that inherently devalues their sovereignty. Bolsen's call to refuse this language is a demand to reject the promise that Western frameworks are universal, urging communities to assert their own terminologies and narratives as valid and sufficient. The concept of refusal as a universal language is central to Bolsen's argument, presented as an act of empowerment and resistance. He posits that refusal transcends cultural and linguistic barriers, serving as a unifying force for those oppressed by global power structures. By saying no to the imposed terms of engagement, whether in diplomacy, economics, or cultural discourse, communities can reclaim agency and redefine their place in the world. Bolsen emphasizes that this refusal is not passive but active, strategic stance that challenges the legitimacy of the predominant factors. He cites historical and contemporary examples of resistance, such as anti-colonial movements, to illustrate how refusal has long been a tool for asserting sovereignty and dignity against oppressive systems. Bolsen further connects this refusal to the broader objectives of the Middle East platform: economic sovereignty, political independence, and psychological decolonization. He argues that adopting the predator's language perpetuates dependency, as it forces nations to seek validation from external powers rather than building self-sufficient systems rooted in their own values. Psychological decolonization in particular is highlighted as a critical step requiring individuals and societies to unlearn the internalized inferiority imposed by colonial narratives. By refusing to speak in terms that prioritize Western nations and interest, communities can begin to dismantle the mental and structural barriers to true independence, fostering a sense of pride in their own intellectual and cultural traditions. As such, Bolsen's monologue is a call to action for the global South and Muslim world to reject the linguistic and ideological domination of global powers. He frames refusal as both a practical and philosophical tool capable of uniting diverse communities in a shared struggle for self-determination by dismantling the colonial myth that one must speak the predator's language to be heard. Bolsen encourages a global reorientation towards epistemological sovereignty, where local languages, values, and frameworks take precedence. This message aligns with his broader advocacy for economic and political autonomy, positioning refusal as a universal language that empowers nations to chart their own path free from external dictation. The commentary serves as both a critique of global power dynamics and a rallying cry for collective resistance through the reclamation of narrative control. The commentary serves as both a critique of global power dynamics and a rallying cry for collective resistance through the reclamation of narrative control. That is what Shahid Bolsen is talking about, and I think we need to give it some time and understand it in an in-depth manner. When you look at Africa, for example, you'll find that most of our countries, like for instance, me talking to you right now, I am an African living in Kenya, but I have a tribe and I have a native language that controls how we talk, because the language you speak says a lot about who you are. Your language holds your culture, it holds your heritage, it holds your personality, and it can tell us where you come from and how you have been socialized to exist among other people. And that is why when Western nations came to the African part of the world, they decided to put their language to be the tool that is used for communication. And they've gone further to reshape this language into different strands, where we are talking right now of things like markets, money, and military. And that is what controls broader global news that is being beamed everywhere. When you look at your news, for example, if you switch to CNN, you'll find it broadcasting about wars going on in different worlds. You'll find it broadcasting about wars going on in different parts of the world. So that will tell you that the global news structure has been conditioned to project war, to project military as a tool for communication by global power structures. You'll also realize that economy forms a major part of news feed that we are given, because it will help reshape your mind into being distressed or being happy. The way economy behaves is what really dictates how you live your life. So that is something that needs to be checked. And I believe it is time people from the global South got and understood the script of these global power structures. They want to continue holding us down, and they want to control our moods, they want to control our mental state, and they are continuing to control and to colonize our minds and intellectual. And that must really be eliminated through all means. I like what Shahid Bolsen is proposing. He wants us to have a session where we as a people can express ourselves freely without being judged, without forcing ourselves to fit into a system that does not really align to who we are, to a system that does not even say anything about us as a people. When you speak English, it will not tell you more about my history, because it has been conditioned to sound and be in this way. But then, if I tell you my language, you'll get to understand my migration story. You'll get to understand how I am socialized with other people. You'll get to understand the kind of cultural things and heritage that my language holds to me. So this really is something that needs to be spread across the world. And that is why I tend to like most Middle Eastern nations. They have refused to go English fully. They are able to speak and communicate with their Arabic language that makes them understand who they are and makes everybody know where they come from. Share your thoughts down in the comment section. And if you're watching us for the first time, please consider subscribing to the channel, like the video, and share. Thank you, and let's meet on the next one.